Thanks for the introduction, Rohan, and the invitation to give a talk at this conference again. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the experiences I've encountered while trying to reproduce analysis with my students and the gap that I encountered between the data availability statement that the journal provides and the ability to actually reproduce the analysis. So a little bit of background. I teach graduate level biostatistics courses at Dalla School of Public Health here at University of Toronto. And in my courses, I incorporate two types of reproducibility exercise. The first one is an in-class reproducibility or reanalysis exercise of a published work. And we do this in a group setting during a 3-hour lecture. And I do give students some pre-class assignment to get to know the paper and to sort of answer some preliminary questions. And hopefully, because of that exercise, the students understand the necessity and the importance of reproducibility. So I require that their group final project that they do at the end of towards the end of the course is fully reproducible. And I implement a peer review system for that. And so because of the first exercise that I mentioned, I'm always looking for published papers that are easily reproducible. And I put easily in quotes because no published work is easily reproducible, or at least I've never encountered any papers that are easily reproducible. Correct me if I'm wrong. I would love to be corrected. Especially in the topics of health science research and in the topic where the analysis involves correlated data, because that's the class that I teach. So I turn to PLOS Medicine often because they do have this data availability statement, and they do require the authors to provide data as part of their paper package. So they require all authors to make all data necessary to replicate study findings because they believe that data availability allows and facilitates validation, replication, reanalysis, and reproducibility of research, and also reduces in the burden of authors in preserving and finding old data and managing data access requests. But is making data available really does that lead to reproducibility of research? And that's, I think is still a challenge because you still need to go through a lot of interpret a lot of the text in the main paper to arrive at the statistical model that the authors are using, and to go through the text to understand what variables they're using, and of course, go through the text and interpret the text to be able to kind of understand what kind of data, what kind of analytical data that they are using at the end of the day. So it requires a very high level of scientific literacy to still reproduce data based on the data that the authors provide. And one of the examples I want to show is this paper that was published in 2020 about social distancing to slow the US COVID-19 epidemic longitudinal pre-test and post-test comparison group study. So in my class, I've done this twice now. A group of students or everybody and I go through the paper and try to reproduce their primary analysis. But in the pre-class assignment, I first asked the students to read the paper and write out the equation of the model that the authors used for the primary analysis. So what they have to do is read this text, right? Because some papers do provide equations, but most applied papers don't. So the students have to read this text and come up with this equation. And so the equation it's a linear mixed effects model, and it has a random intercept term for a state. State is the cluster, and the days are the units of analysis. And so the authors do kind of, you know, explain what this equation is in English, but going from the English to the model takes a lot of statistical and scientific literacy. And unfortunately, less than half of the students were able to write out the correct model equation. A lot of the students forgot to put the random intercept sign. So that was the biggest mistake that the students made. And I also asked the students what variables are needed to fit the model. So I asked the students actually the minimum number of variables that we need to fit the model. So to fit a linear mixed effects model, the authors use LME4 package in R. They use the LMER function, and that's what we use too to fit the model. And to fit this model in R, we need at least 4 variables. So state, the outcome, time, and the implementation period, which is a binary variable. And only 40% of the students identified the 4 minimum variables needed to fit the model. So a lot of the students forgot to list the variable state, right, which is like the ID variable in this model. And so I think one biggest issue is that these variables, those 4 variables, are they available in the data that is listed in the data availability statement, right? So in the data availability statement, the authors provide 2 sources of data. One is a GitHub repo of the New York Times. Then they list, they have a data set of all COVID-19 cases and deaths for each state. And then in their supplementary material, they provide another table that shows the date of implementation of statewide social distancing measures. Okay, so these are the data that they provide in the data availability statement. But these data don't contain the outcome or the explanatory variables needed to fit the model. I mean, they have the state variable, which is used to merge the 2 data sets, but that's all they have. And the actual outcome that the authors use is a derived outcome, right? And we had to do a lot of pre-processing to arrive at the analytical data. And not to mention there are missing values, inclusion, exclusion criteria, date restriction that we have to parse through the text to arrive at the final model. So a lot of pre-processing was needed, again, to arrive at the final data. We have to pre-process the COVID-19 date, the cases data, and then also the physical distance, implementation of physical distancing data first, and then the cases data, and then merge the 2, and then still do more pre-processing to arrive at the final data. So, we need to interpret English to R to be able to reproduce anything, right? Or other coding language of interest. And I think making data available is only the first step of reproducible science. And even so, like in health science research, especially, making data available is a huge barrier for some researchers. Preserving data privacy was the biggest barrier to practice reproducibility research based on this paper in 2018. And the second reason is lack of time, especially for the academics. So I thought that was funny that academics don't have time to be able to make their research reproducible, which is ironic because I'm sure the academics are the ones who are calling for reproducible science. Okay, but in our recent paper that we submitted, which we illustrate 2 methods applied to dental data. I'm not going to talk too much about the actual paper because it's still under review, unfortunately, but we submitted it to an oral health journal, and they didn't require the data to be available. However, because this was an illustration of methods, we still wanted to provide data and code where the readers can apply our method that we describe for their own data, right? So we did create a GitHub repo with simulated data and R code to reproduce the results. And this beautiful repo was created by my first year student, Sean, who's at the Dalla School of Public Health. He's a PhD in biostatistics. And in our repo, we provide two sets of simulated data, which closely resembles the real data, and we provide the R code for data processing and the analysis. So the first half of the R code is about pre-processing the data, because in order to fit this particular model, extended Cox model, using the Cox pH function, data needs to be in a particular format. And so with using simulated data, we can still show how the variables, or what variables are needed to fit the model, and how to format and structure the data. And I think that's the key to be able to reproduce data, because the raw data is one thing, but the analytical data is another thing, because the analytical data is the data that you actually throw into the function of the statistical software where they produce the results, right? And it needs to be in a specific format or structure based on, usually, it's the same across software languages, but it needs to be in a specific format. And that's I think the most challenging thing to arrive at. And with this, readers may not be able to reproduce the results, but they can still replicate the analysis with their own data. Okay, so some final thoughts. I think we need to really ask ourselves, to whom do we want to make our research reproducible, right? So who's the audience of our research? And of course, you always want to make yourself make your research reproducible for yourself. But in this applied dental paper, our audience was probably dental researchers, and they don't have a high level of statistical literacy. So we did, kind of provided a step-by-step approach to how to use the R code and how to format their data to be able to fit the model. Yeah, so I said this before, providing the right data format or the structure is crucial to reproducible results, because we need to really think about how the data was processed and who was included in the final analysis, what variables were created, and what variables are needed to fit the model. And all of this is usually provided in the text of the manuscript or the paper. But again, we need a high level of statistical or data science literacy to interpret the text into actual code. And I want to end with this quote that I think is great. Your research is the full software, environment, code, and data that produce the results. And your manuscript is actually an advertisement of your research. And I think it's important to not just, advertise your research, but then to share your actual research, which is the full environment of code and data that produce the results. So yeah, that's all I have to say. I don't know if, are we taking questions now or maybe later, or?